Started. So welcome everyone to Exploring Offshore Wind and Transmission Planning. This is an hour-long webinar and we're happy to have you here this afternoon. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the participants are muted and off screen. But we do encourage you to please use the Q&A function for the discussion portion that follows the presentations today. We really do want to have this to be as interactive as possible. So please do put any questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So next slide, please. So my name is Catherine Reed, and I am a Senior Program Director with the National Association of State Energy Officials. For those of you who are not familiar with NASEO, which is what we call NASEO, it's a national nonprofit organization, and we represent state energy officials from all of the 56 states and territories. We serve as a resource for and about state energy offices, and we do it through a variety of means. We have topical committees on a breadth of energy topics. We host regional dialogues on these topics and on emerging energy issues. And we provide informational events that facilitate peer learning and best practice sharing, such as this event today. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of what we'll be covering today. And I want to just say I'm extremely excited to have these impressive speakers, whom I will introduce shortly. But before we do, I wanted to provide a little bit of big picture context for why we chose these topics for this webinar. You know, with the ambitious goals for offshore wind that have been announced at a national level, but also along with the state level goals for offshore wind and for clean energy generally, it's clear that you can't have these conversations about offshore wind or clean energy without talking about transmission. And there have been, of course, numerous efforts underway in the past and currently underway that are too long to list here, and they warrant their own webinar. But I do want to mention that in addition to the continued state level efforts that we're seeing on both coasts on offshore wind, we're looking at a variety of initiatives through the U.S. Department of Energy and the national labs to explore all of the facets of this complicated topic. And I'll just mention the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study, the National Transmission Planning Study, the National Transmission Needs Study, the West Coast Offshore Wind Transmission Literature Review and Gap Study. All of these are currently underway and are in various stages of completion or heading toward that. But so there are a variety, there are so many efforts underway, but we wanted to highlight two, largely because it's a great pairing of sort of a national big picture kind of approach, as well as a state level initiative. The timing, there was a kind of a convergence of timing with the release of the benefit and urgency of planned offshore transmission, which is the Brattle Group report, which you'll be hearing about today. And that was in January. And then about a month later, the Maine's governor, Janet Mills, announced its offshore wind roadmap. So we'll be hearing about both of these. Sort of you have the big picture and then the state level perspective. So before we get into those exciting topics, I do want to briefly introduce our co-host with the American Council on Renewable Energy. Barbara Tyron is here. She is not only a co-host, or her organization is a co-host, but also ACORE is an affiliate member of NASEO. So welcome, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And thanks to NASEO for the chance to have this webinar for everyone, and particularly to Catherine for her very conscientious and thorough organization of today's webinar. I'm delighted that we're going to have the Brattle Group talk today about the report that they produced, which is entitled The Benefit and Urgency of Planned Offshore Transmission, Reducing the Costs of and Barriers to Achieving U.S. Clean Energy Goals. Joe DeLosa, who's with us, is one of the key authors, and there's some notable takeaways that the report lays out, including the urgent case for proactively and holistically planning transmission. So I think you're in for a real treat. This report, by the way, was prepared for NRDC, GridLab, Clean Energy or Clean Air Task Force, American Clean Power Association, and also for my organization, ACORE. So with that, Catherine, I'll turn it back to you for the next introduction.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker. Joe DeLosa is with the Brattle Group, and he is a manager at Brattle Group, where he is currently advising clients on integrating offshore wind generation into the transmission grid and on the future of wholesale electricity markets. Before joining Brattle, he was bureau chief of the federal and regional policy at the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, where he managed all RTO and federal affairs for the state. Welcome, Joe, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Barbara, for that great introduction. I'm really excited and really honored to have the opportunity to talk to the group today about both our report, as well as some of the broader context on a national level in terms of transmission planning and how we might be able to improve and coordinate some of those processes together to get the best outcome for ratepayers. I do tend to come from a little bit of a state perspective with some of my history as bureau chief with the NJBPU. So I think you'll see that littered maybe throughout the presentation here a little bit. So if we could hop to slide 1, we'll start in the offshore wind setting, where we see significant growth in both the near-term goals as well as significant estimates of the long-term offshore wind need of the country. To achieve national decarbonization, we see certain studies, including Princeton University, showing the need for between 200 and over 400 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. And we can see that the scale of these 2050 needs, even compared to really already aggressive 30 to 50 gigawatt announced state targets by 2030, 2035, are really significant. And so thinking about the best way to proactively plan the system, not only for the 2030 and 35 goals, but also for the 2050 goals, really presents a sense of urgency. And before we go to slide 2, I'll just note that some of the buildup, as well as some additional information about the report, will be available in the appendix slides that will get posted after the presentation here today. So heading to slide 2, what we see when we take a step back and look at those offshore wind needs is that decisions made today will directly impact what options are available to meet the long-term state and national offshore wind goals. In particular, we know that major transmission projects, such as those needed at the backbone level for coordinated planning, take a decade or more to develop. We also see that any coordinated solution for offshore wind will need to be deployed sufficiently in advance of the generation project to make sure that the transmission is actually available when the generation resource is needed to protect customers from the project-on-project risk in that scenario. What we see if holistic planning is not used and instead an individualized generator interconnection one at a time planning framework is used, we'll see that the best points of interconnection for early projects, even those that result in potentially least cost generation bids, will be used up, which will limit and make more expensive future options for meeting those longer term goals. We'll also see technology or electrical design choices for individual projects that might not allow integration with the future offshore network, which we'll talk about on the coming slides. And I'll just highlight what you see at the bottom of the slide here, that a 5-year delay of planning might cut these benefits in half as these most optimal POIs are used up and some of the community impacts really begin. And so moving to the next slide, what do we really mean at the highest level, right? When we're talking about coordinated transmission planning for offshore wind, this slide kind of breaks it down into 2 groups. One is the objectives. What objectives are we trying to achieve? And then what are some of the concepts that have been kind of thought of to get us there? So we'll start at the top of the slide with the 3 primary elements that we've seen in our experience. One is identifying the best POI, which we touched on a little bit earlier, identifying the best location on the onshore electric grid to interconnect these offshore wind resources at the lowest cost. The second is community impacts and offshore impacts. How can the onshore, offshore, or landfall, right, the beach or the shore, depending on what state you're in, how can those impacts be reduced, right? Including through high capacity lines or coordinated onshore transmission corridors. And then number three is potentially using these offshore facilities to reinforce the existing grid, including ways in which offshore networks could be created to route the power both from the offshore wind facilities to the points on the grid where it could be the most beneficial, as well as improving the operations of the onshore grid, allowing some of that power transfer. And so moving to the bottom of the slide here, we'll take a look at some of the concepts that have been conceptualized to actually achieve this goal. Starting from the left, where we see the kind of one at a time, what we call radial tie lines, where each individual offshore wind project will have its own both offshore lead line as well as its own landfall point and its own point of interconnection. With a mesh generation tie, it takes a lot from the radial design, but the offshore platforms are designed in such a way that future technology might allow a future construction project to connect the offshore wind platforms to create additional benefits. This can be included in the design at a fraction of the total cost of the offshore wind generation. And I actually see a typo at the bottom of the slide that should say New York and New Jersey network ready requirements, as both of those states have actually required their recent solicitations offshore platforms to include mesh ready design. The middle is the offshore collector, where we would have an offshore piece of infrastructure that would collect the output of multiple wind farms. In the New Jersey evaluation report, which is all public, what we've seen is that some of the technology surrounding the size of the offshore collectors might not be sized to allow the injection of multiple large offshore wind farms, which at this point in the current technology really limits the use of the offshore collector design. But it is a really interesting one as technology continues to develop. What New Jersey did end up with is the onshore collector, which is envisioning a scenario where each offshore facility has its own lead line to the shore, but then a coordinated landing point as well as transition vault from that landing point to the point of interconnection to minimize onshore disturbances as well as community interruption, but also allowing the offshore wind resources control over a large portion of their facilities. And then all the way on the right, we've heard a lot about a backbone offshore grid, which is where each offshore wind farm would not have its own tie to shore, but would rely on a network backbone to actually deliver the output of their wind farm from their collector station to the onshore grid. So we'll move to the next slide from there. And what we see here, this is a summary from the report, what we found in terms of benefits for planning for at least 100 gigawatts of additional US offshore wind generation by 2050. We think based on our experience that we can reduce overall transmission costs by about 20 billion relative to one at a time interconnection. We also think it can result in 60 to 70% fewer shore crossings, and depending on the design, approximately 50% fewer marine transmission cable miles. We also think such proactive planning can offer additional benefits, including eliminating interconnection and transmission-related delays by accelerating the onshore construction that would otherwise be needed and also delayed until the end of an interconnection process. Reducing project development and cost escalation risks by identifying and selecting projects ahead of time with known costs and potentially cost containment measures, as well as reducing environmental and community impacts by coordinating to the greatest extent all of these onshore facility needs. So if we could move to the next slide. And I realized this is a study that the Brattle Group has put out a couple years ago, prior to the most recent study that shows some of this in an example of New England. But I realized that we have Celina here to talk about the specific New England context. So I think I will actually just leave this slide for people to review in the appendix and actually move on to the next slide. And so understanding kind of the broader audience on this call and that not all states have offshore wind goals, I also wanted to spend maybe the back half of my time kind of connecting some of these offshore wind planning efforts and concepts to the national context surrounding transmission planning. And what we see is that US transmission planning is siloed. You see the word Balkanized on the slide there. I like that one too. But what that means is basically there are individual study processes that aren't coordinated, and in large part, reliability processes that exist in these silos account for 90% plus of all US transmission investment. And those processes do not consider at all economic or public policy needs when developing solutions. In particular, in the top, you'll see the blue outline around the generator interconnection processes. Everything today related to offshore wind, aside from some of the coordinated efforts in New England and the New Jersey State Agreement approach, exist in that bucket, in that silo, where together with other renewable and other resource requests are caught up in a long delayed interconnection processes across the country. And aside from the substantial delays, studying these facilities one at a time, as the current generator interconnection queues do, in large part, will not identify efficient long-term solutions for the suite of resources needed to meet public policy requests. And so down at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that, as I mentioned, the planning for economic and public policy needs results in a very, very small piece of the transmission investment. And interregional planning processes basically have nothing to show for the coordination that has been mandated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So moving to slide 7, we have some recommendations to take the planning process from this kind of siloed current structure to the 21st century and meet the needs of an evolving transmission system. We'll go through them one at a time. So first, the proactively planning for future generation and load requires discussions between states and planning entities to ensure that the appropriate assumptions are included at the foundation of planning analysis. And this may sound simple, but we see across the country that many planning processes actually don't include these realistic projections of the generation mix in their forward-looking transmission plans. Number 2, on the basis of these updated assumptions, there needs to be a use of multi-value and multi-driver planning to identify the suite of needs that are driven by these assumptions. And then accounting for a wide range of benefits allows selection of the most beneficial projects to identify and solve the wide range of needs that can be kind of created by these assumptions. Number 3, we'll see inevitable uncertainties in the transmission planning process, and we can address those through scenario-based planning, which means on the basis of those realistic assumptions, stress testing the grid, both for edge case future resource deployment scenarios, as well as real-world extreme system events to identify facilities that can be net beneficial even under these extreme circumstances. Number 4, on the basis of this scenario planning, you can then identify a comprehensive network portfolio that can meet a number of these needs in the most effective way possible. And when you take a look at a wide network portfolio of solutions, it's likely that the benefits will be widespread and diverse and will lower some of the cost allocation concerns that are obviously top of mind for several states and areas. And then number 5 is jointly planning interregionally to identify scenarios where an interregional project would solve a need or a suite of needs more efficiently than intra-regional planning processes might. And moving on to the next slide, we can apply some of these concepts to the generator interconnection queues. And I think that will be on the next slide. And so, perfect, thank you so much. And so when we apply it to the generator interconnection queues, these translate into best practices that we see in a number of locations, but not all across the country, and certainly not uniformly implemented. And we'll go through these quickly because they particularly relate to offshore wind and the evolution of that piece of the planning process. And so we can ensure efficient queue management by making sure that a wide range of interconnection facilities are studied at once to identify efficient outcomes, as well as moving to number two, making sure that regional or deep network upgrades are taken a look at through the scope of regional planning and not only generator interconnection. That's directly tied to number three, which is the study criteria that are applied to the generator interconnection process that drive potentially some of these major deep network upgrades that maybe should not be driven or identified through the generator interconnection process. And then in number four, when you select solutions in response to some of these needs, making sure, as we discussed on the last slide, that these solutions are evaluated in a multi-value way, taking a look at the broad suite of benefits that exist. And then cost allocation, right? The more efficient the projects are and the better the benefit calculation is in response to these transmission projects, the wider the benefits are going to be distributed and the less contentious the cost allocation discussions are likely to be. And so if we could go to the next slide, we'll go through a few brief examples of where proactive planning, particularly for generator interconnection, has demonstrated some benefits. This slide talks a little bit about the MISO and SPP-JTIQ, which is the Joint Targeted Interconnection Study, that took a look at 5 years of generator interconnection requests and did exactly what we were talking about on the previous slide. Took a look at deep network upgrades that would be needed to facilitate these interconnection requests. And the results were a 7-project portfolio that not only supported the 9 gigawatts of existing requests, but also an additional 20 gigawatts of projects at a cost of about half, as you see at the bottom of the slide there, what you have historically seen through individual generator interconnection project costs. Moving on to the next slide in PJM. PJM hasn't conducted, at this point, a region-wide proactive planning effort. Obviously, New Jersey was a one-state specific effort, but they have conducted a recent study, which we have titled here the 75 gigawatt study. If you're looking for that on Google, you should search Offshore Wind Transmission Study Phase 1. But we refer to it to the 75 gigawatt study because it's more instructive in the fact that PJM has added to its model a full 75 gigawatts of renewables, including over 14 gigawatts of offshore wind, and not just offshore wind, and has shown that when you look at this holistically in this way, you can actually achieve these interconnections for $3.2 billion, compared to previous studies estimates of the cost of interconnection offshore wind. It's about 1/10 of the cost, looking at it holistically through this way. And then the last example that we have here is MISO on the next slide. And MISO really has shown a high degree of leadership in evolving its regional plan and taking initiative to show leadership in this area, to use scenario-based modeling to identify a suite of multi-value and multi-driver projects that make up their long-range transmission plan, or LRTP here. And what we see is that MISO has relied on scenario-based future development in close coordination with the MISO states to develop a forward-looking future on which they have identified a group of multi-value projects that not only will enable a wide range, you see here 53 gigawatts of renewable interconnections, but also meet a high degree of reliability needs that are seen over the coming years, as well as reducing costs system-wide and producing a number of other net benefits that are created by the careful planning of these LRTP facilities. And so I see we only have a couple minutes left, so we'll end with a few summary recommendations on the final slide. First, efficient planning requires simultaneous consideration of a broad range of drivers and benefits. So today's planning process, as we mentioned earlier on, relies 90+% on reliability. And evaluating multiple planning drivers together, including market efficiency and public policy alongside reliability, truly requires leadership from planners and planning regions to identify more efficient solutions. And these will be tough calls to make by the regional planners. FERC is looking at the concept of an independent transmission monitor who hopefully can provide data and encourage some more of these tough calls to be made. But we understand that transitioning from a reliability-based planning process to a multi-value system is going to be a challenging transition. Second, when a wide range of benefits is considered, it reduces the divisiveness of cost allocation. And so when a portfolio of projects and a portfolio approach is used in response to scenarios, the benefits are likely to be broadly distributed and exceed costs, which reduces some of the litigation concerns that have existed historically around cost allocation. And then finally the goal is to change the focus away from these local, not only near-term reliability, but also individually planned generator interconnection needs or individually planned in one cluster. Far too much ratepayer money is spent on solutions either locally planned by the by the transmission owner or planned in a narrowly drawn generation interconnection queue that may or likely is not the best solution for the future of the grid. And evaluating those efficient solutions require that level of leadership to look across the planning drivers and identify an efficient multi-value, multi-benefit solution that considers all the needs and will really efficiently underlie the future of the grid. So as I mentioned, there's more information in the appendix. I hope you found some of this helpful, and I look forward to the discussion portion of the webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was really informative. And I have to say, given the complexity of the topic, I think you did a really fantastic job of breaking it down into something that I can understand. So thank you for that. So what we'll do is hold questions until the very end. And right now we'd like to introduce Celina Cunningham. And Celina Cunningham is the Deputy Director of the Governor's Energy Office in Maine, where she leads the Renewable Energy and Markets team. She has 2 decades of experience leading on energy, climate, and natural resource issues in the public and private sector, including at the U.S. Department of the Interior and as staff at the U.S. House of Representatives. So Celina, thank you so much for being here and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Catherine. And it's always great to listen to Joe and hear about the incredible analysis that they've done at Brattle to move us forward on transmission issues. So as Catherine mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap that the state recently completed, as well as some of the transmission planning work that we had. If you can go to the next slide. So since the Governor Mills was in office in 2019, the state has taken a number of important steps to pass bipartisan laws related to reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so we've gone through a number of iterations of a climate action plan that puts in place strategies that really cross numerous sectors of how to achieve these clean energy and climate reduction requirements. You go to the next slide, please. by not only reducing our reliance on fossil fuels for our current energy mix. Right now, New England is about 40% reliant on natural gas. We also know that we're going to increase the amount of electricity we need over the next coming decades, including doubling our load in Maine as a result of beneficial electrification. And so we are committed to advancing a diverse approach to meet our renewable energy targets, including offshore wind. Next slide, please. So we have a RPS in place that is set a goal of 80% renewable energy by 2030. The governor recently announced her intent to pursue 100% by 2040, and we'll soon launch a planning process to develop a state energy plan to achieve that goal. Under the 80% by 2030 law, there are a number of procurements that the Public Utilities Commission issued, including 2 tranches in 2020 and 2021, to procure 14% of the statewide electricity load. And these projects are already showing results in terms of putting downward pressure on Maine ratepayers. Just last year, $68 million was saved for Maine ratepayers as a result of these projects. So we're seeing results in that way. And recently, the legislature passed a bill related to unlocking northern Maine wind. Maine has a long history of having incredible onshore wind resources, particularly in northern Maine, and an interest from an economic development perspective in terms of building projects there. However, the onshore transmission constraints have been a challenge to unlock those resources. And so the legislature passed a bill that authorized the Public Utilities Commission to procure transmission as well as a gigawatt of wind or renewable energy from northern Maine. And so the PUC took action on both those and recently awarded the companies for the 1 gigawatt King Pine wind, as well as for LS Power for the transmission line. And the reason why I want to talk about this is, one is that when we think about transmission planning, we think about it both in terms of our onshore needs, but also offshore, and how we should think about that more holistically. And interestingly, we recognized the importance of serving not only Maine's electricity needs, but also thinking about the broader New England energy needs. And so as part of this project, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts agreed to purchase up to 40% of the wind and transmission from this. And so this has been a remarkable effort that was both 2 legislative bodies and 2 public utilities commissions working together to pass authorizing language and allow the public utilities commissions to put together a package for the companies. And I think, it just shows what's possible when we work regionally. And I think it can be a really cost-effective way to advance renewable energy and transmission going forward. So we're excited about that partnership. We certainly learned a lot about how our different states and entities look at projects differently. And so I think the more that we can coordinate, the better the results will be down the road. You go to the next slide, please. So in terms of meeting our renewable energy goals, how we're going to do that is through a diverse approach. And we've done a number of assessments in terms of what the energy mix is that we need. And what's clear is that we will need offshore wind to meet the state's energy needs. Recent modeling shows that we'll need 3 gigawatts by 2050. And we've seen modeling from New England broadly in terms of what's needed from the Gulf of Maine, and at least 12 to 15 gigawatts will be assumed to come from the Gulf of Maine for floating offshore wind. And so we are pursuing offshore wind not only from an energy perspective, but also the incredible economic opportunity that this industry is already bringing the US and is poised to continue over the coming years. I think so far, $13.5 billion have been invested in the US for offshore wind, and it's on track to reach $70 billion in the next decade or so. And so Maine has a long history in terms of advancing R&D for offshore wind. Given the water depths in the Gulf of Maine, we'll need floating technology. And so our university and others have been working on that for many years. And so the governor announced or launched the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative, which is an internal state entity. The governor's energy office coordinates with other state agencies to put together these 4 key areas of focus, including planning, stakeholder engagement, research and innovation, policy and legislation, and partnerships. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of these, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. But it's really the driving force behind what we have been doing. And if you go to the next slide. And as we were beginning to build out the plan over the last couple of years, a couple of things of note. One is that the federal government announced plans to lease in the Gulf of Maine by 2020, at the end of 2024. And we also realized that we had a lot of different interests when it comes to advancing offshore wind, not only the economic component, but also looking at from a port infrastructure, what's needed, supply chain, workforce, environmental considerations, as well as the fishing industry, which is incredibly important to Maine's economy and culture. And so we launched the development of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap. This was funded with U.S. Economic Development Administration funding, and we put together an advisory committee and 4 working groups with nearly 100 public and private experts to really put together comprehensive recommendations about how the state should responsibly advance offshore wind. And the working groups put in a tremendous amount of time. We had a number of technical studies that were part of this, including a transmission report, as well as an energy needs assessment and other components that really ensured that we were having a data-driven approach to the recommendations that the state was going to pursue. And so we see this as our driving force in terms of how we are pursuing and implementing the plan for offshore wind. And there are a lot of different components to it. And some of it is in the government, some is external, but it's will be it's driving what we are doing in the state. If you go to the next slide, please. And as I mentioned, preserving Maine's thriving marine economy and the fishing industry is obviously central to this. And that's important not only when it comes to overarching offshore wind policy, but also transmission and thinking about how to minimize impacts to fishing grounds and maximizing points of interconnection to do so effectively. So that is top of mind, as well as protecting the environment and preserving Maine's traditions and culture. Next slide. So the results of the roadmap is that the offshore wind industry is a multi-sector effort developing. We needed a comprehensive strategy that requires diverse experience and expertise and views. And these are the 5 objectives. I'm not going to read them to you, but under each of these objectives, there are 26 strategies and 111 implementation actions. Some of these the state is already working on, others are going to take a longer term effort in terms of seeing results. And we are certainly mapping these to the available infrastructure and IRA funding to see how we can leverage federal funding and also partnerships to achieve the results here. And key themes are on the right of this form, this slide that continued to come up in our working group conversations, including the need for regional coordination and collaboration. So that is central to a lot of the work that is in the roadmap and that we're undertaking. Next slide. So objective B, I'm going to skip some of it so you don't have to see all the details, but happy to provide a link so you can read the full document. But strategy B is focusing on harnessing abundant renewable energy to control costs and fight climate change. And this includes establishing a offshore wind procurement coordinated regionally to achieve cost-effective deployment. Right now, our legislature is reviewing proposals related to offshore wind procurement, so we'll see what happens in the coming months there. A key part of this working group also focused on regional transmission and how can we maximize efforts by coordinating and with other states to support transmission development, and also the need to advocate for federal leasing mechanisms that support Maine's goals. And so this group spent a lot of time thinking about energy transmission, and feel free to read the actions and look for a little bit more detail if you want to learn about that. Go to the next slide, please. So we are, as many of you know, and I think as Joe briefly talked about, as well as Catherine, part of the New England States Transmission Initiative. And this was really built out of the New England States vision for a clean, affordable, reliable 21st century regional electric grid released in 2020. And the states announced this effort. The objectives are here. And in essence, it's looking to modernize our advancement of high voltage direct current technologies that can help address longstanding reliability and energy security concerns, and unlock world-class renewable resources and reduce costs to consumers, and critically help reduce impacts. And so Maine has been working along with Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island with support from New Hampshire and Vermont on this effort. And you can go to the next slide, please. And I should say that a lot of work has come out of Connecticut in particular, as well as other states, to put this proposal forward. And so key events, I listed the key events here. Some of you may be familiar with. We issued an RFI in 2022, which is really the culmination of years of effort to think about how we can coordinate and look at this HVDC technology regionally. And then in 2022, the states requested proposals related to the Grid Innovation and Program Funding Opportunity Announcement. And then the state submitted a joint state innovation partnership for offshore wind concept paper to the DOE. And so I think more work is to come related to this broader initiative, and each state will take its own approach in how, how to prioritize its needs from where are the offshore wind projects in terms of timeline, what are the onshore constraints and needs, and how to work collaboratively to achieve those results. And so we're certainly encouraged by the strong partnerships with the states, and then also working with ISO through NESCO, as well as FERC, to think about how we can address some of the cost issues and other things that Joe touched on earlier. But we, our regional engagement is, can you go to the next slide, please? We are continuing to work with the U.S. Department of Energy, as well as ISO New England, on some of their longer term studies that can help inform the work that's happening in the states. And we'll continue to support the Maine New England States Transmission Initiative and determine how to best take advantage of these federal dollars that are coming, and to support Maine people and our broader economic and energy goals related to offshore wind. So that's a high level overview, and I look forward to the discussion as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Celina. That was really fantastic to get a really comprehensive overview of all the work that you all are doing at the state level. So I do want to just quickly get to the Q&A. We already have some questions that have popped in. So the first question is, how much, if any, offshore wind planning is currently regional? What are the positive and negative aspects? I guess this is a question for, well, I guess for both of you, but Joe, I think it came up during your presentation.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to jump in. It's an interesting question, right? Regional. So we'll take the New Jersey SAA as an example. So it is regional in the respect that it is planned together with PJM. So it took a look at what regional facilities might be required to enable New Jersey, but it's not regional in the sense of New England's effort or the PJM 75 gigawatt study, where it's taking a look at everyone's offshore wind goals in the region and taking a look at the best facilities for all of those goals. So I would say in one way it is regional. It's kind of the most regional that it was at the time. But I would say New England, and Celina, I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this. As she mentioned, they have the New England States Transmission Initiative, which has sought funding from DOE to kind of look at some potential regional solution. And that feels a little bit more regional in the sense that that proposal seems to take a look at all the different states' goals.
And what I might add to that is that I think, as Joe's slide pointed out, that different regulatory and government roles when it comes to offshore wind have been separate. And I think what we're trying to do in the Gulf of Maine is see how much we can do some proactive planning, although we're not answering all those questions early on. And one thing is, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has the authority to lease areas for specific offshore wind leases. And then the states are making their own decisions around procurement. And so there are each of these different pieces. And so we have found that there is coordination on each of them separately. And then I think the overall goal is how can we collectively bring those different bodies together and states and come up with a plan. And so In the Gulf of Maine, in some ways, we're behind Southern New England and New Jersey, New York, so we have some time. But we certainly don't have all the policy pieces at every level of government to achieve those results. So it's an important conversation to continue to have.
Yeah, and I might pick up something there that's maybe a little bit outside the realm of transmission, but definitely related, is that, and this is something that would take probably a change in law to figure out, but as Celina mentioned, the leasing process and the generation procurement process and the transmission process are all very different, right? You know, my slides were talking about on the transmission side, there's silos, but on the leasing side, there's also a lot of different silos where in Europe, you know, every country is more like a state in the US where they have their own leasing, and then they hold their procurements in a way where you can actually have competitions between different firms. And then if you win the competition, you get the lease, right? As a function of your competitive bid, as opposed to the other way around, where today, the price of the lease is really a tax on state offshore wind programs, right? Because the cost of the lease is embedded in the cost of the offshore wind generation, right? But it also impacts transmission because you don't know where you're going with the right coordinated transmission ahead of time, right? So you have this kind of chicken and an egg problem where we need to coordinate transmission to get out to the lease areas, but you don't know where you're going, right? You don't know which lease area is going to win. And if you flip that on its head and you could say, okay, well, this is lease area 1 for New Jersey and this is lease area 2 for New Jersey, then you could actually coordinate and you might have competition in terms of who builds there, but you wouldn't have this kind of process issue that really results in kind of not only inefficient planning, but also that kind of tax on state offshore wind policies.
Thank you. That's fascinating. We have another question here. Can you talk about multi-value efforts and or point to specific examples? MISO, New York ISO. Yeah,
so I actually was going to touch on New York ISO in a second and talk about how them in California are kind of a little bit different than some of the other regional plans that we're talking about, because they have the luxury of their region also being their state, right? So it really works a little bit different in New York and California, where they can take a look at public policy. But again, it's tough to classify that as regional, even though it is a regional plan under FERC Order 890 and so on. I would say MISO, in terms of a multi-state region, is really on the forefront of this multi-value planning. Their long-range transmission plan that I touched on a little bit in the slides really does kind of start from the beginning with a very thorough evaluation with states of what their expected state policies are. And then it forecasts that out in a series of scenarios. So you have a future 1 that's like the lowest renewable development, and then future 2, and then future 3. And what MISO does is they look forward and they take a look at, well, what transmission projects are useful across all of these futures, and what transmission projects are likely going to be needed in response to things like severe weather events or reliability needs or market efficiency needs moving forward. And then they select the projects that are going to be responsive to not any one of those needs, but the full suite of needs. And what you see is that when you do that, there are a broadly distributed set of benefits that also outweighs the cost of the transmission investment. So I would really point to MISO's LRTP as kind of the gold standard of this. SPP also is in the process of developing this kind of coordination between their planning silos. And I would say the East Coast RTOs lag behind somewhat.
Well, thank you. That was great. We have another question, and this is more about the state involvement. So Celina, do you have any recommendations for state energy offices to get engaged in transmission planning as required by the state energy program now? I mean, you all are doing it largely because it's goal driven, but do you have any recommendations on how that might happen at the state level?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on how your state is organized. We partner with our Public Utilities Commission quite a bit, and they have obviously longstanding relationships and responsibilities around engaging with ISO and FERC. And so depending on how big the office is, we like to leverage our, they have a lot of resources and a little bit larger than we are, so we like to work closely with them. I also feel like following the work of NREL and ISO when they do have public meetings can be really helpful to just understand the basics. And then I found that engaging with members of the industry to help answer questions has been helpful. And then I think as NASEO is really good at connecting states to learn from one another. So I'd be happy to share information that we have. We're also thinking about how to take the work that we've done in the roadmap and build onto it. In addition to the regional conversation, what else in the state do we need to do to continue our planning, whether it's looking at points of interconnection, working with communities, thinking about coordinated transmission when it comes to potentially procurement. How do we organize a procurement in a way to maximize that? So it depends on what tools they're most interested in focusing on, but I think there's more work than any one entity or person can do. So prioritizing is probably the most important part, and I'm happy to follow up directly with them.
Thank you, Celina. And a little follow-up question regarding the stakeholders that you engaged with the offshore wind roadmap. Are they still, or do you have them, are they ongoing, or has their work completed, or are they kind of ongoing working groups?
So we had the working groups just for the portion, the 2 years that we were doing the roadmap process. A couple of the specific actions coming out was creating a fisheries working group as well as a environment and wildlife working group. And so those will continue with as well. And then we also have under the Maine Climate Council an energy working group that continues these conversations. And so as a result of recent legislation, we also recently launched the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium, which is looking at how to increase our understanding of potential benefits and impacts of floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And so trying to find other venues to continue the collaborative stakeholder discussions in a sustainable manner has been a priority, given that it was a one-time $2 million grant from the federal government.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think we have, let's see, there's one more question that actually I have that I don't see anything in the chat right now. And this follows up on something, Joe, that I think you had in yours, but I think it applies to both of you. I think you had mentioned that interregional planning processes have largely been ineffective. And I didn't know if it was because of the siloed nature of it and the fact I wasn't quite sure, but you also said that it's necessary. And I know Celina was talking about the regional approach. So can you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. That could be its own hour webinar or 3-hour webinar.
Just in 2 minutes. Yeah, quick.
Yeah, right. So you got to start at the beginning, right? Everyone on this call is familiar with cost allocation, right? And so as part of but the kind of foundational transmission planning orders called Order 1000 from the FERC, there's been a prohibition on allocating costs out of a region unless that other region explicitly agrees to pay the costs of the interregional project. And so with that framework, it really has created friction in terms of who pays for what on a lot of these RTO borders. And growing from that, there is kind of not robust coordination between the different regions. So they have kind of an informational plan, but the actual instances of interregional planning are limited to, very specific instances, as opposed to what we need, which is a coordination at a much more fundamental level where the different RTOs would look at the needs across RTOs and, like multi-value planning, kind of come up with the best solution and then share the cost, right, of those facilities. And so some of the rules don't allow that, and also, therefore kind of preclude some of the more coordinated planning that I think would be required to get to the best outcome.
Thank you. That's helpful. And Celina, did you have anything to add to that?
No, that was a great summary.
Okay, well, we have excellent job, Joe. You did it in 2 minutes. Okay, are there any more questions from any of the participants or the panelists? Okay, well, we greatly appreciate, well, first of all, the special thanks to both of our speakers, Celina and Joe. Really fantastic information, and your slides are also quite thorough, so I think they'll be useful. We did receive I think this is just sort of like the season of webinars. I think there were a lot of conflicting schedules. So I think there are a lot of people who are interested who reached out that weren't able to attend today. So we will be able to share those, and we'll have them posted on the NASEO website. And we will also follow up with all of the registrants, so you all will have a direct link to the recording and the slides afterwards. So unless anyone else has anything to add, I want to thank you all for presenting. Thank you to all the participants for chiming in today. Thanks to ACORE, to Barbara, and look forward to, yes, and very much look forward to having continuing conversations. I believe as these other initiatives are developing, I'm sure this is not the last of this topic on a webinar for NASEO. So look forward to talking with you more. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.